In this video, we'll be talking about cognitive behavior therapies. So cognitive behavior therapy, CBT, is an umbrella term. And underneath of that, we have multiple different therapeutic approaches. And we'll only be talking about two of those today, despite that there's well over 100 cognitive behavioral therapies that exist. So we'll only be talking about two of those. They're probably the two most popular, the two most well-known, and really the two original cognitive behavior therapies. So we have REBT by Albert Ellis, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, and then we have Cognitive Therapy by Aaron Beck. And we'll talk about Ellis first. It seems as though his theory was developed first and then Beck's came afterwards. So before we get into the specifics about the approaches and really where they converge and where they diverge, they have really built cognitive behavioral therapies are built on the ABC model, and this is different than the ABCs of behavior therapy, right? So in the ABCs of cognitive behavior therapy, we have A for activating event, B for belief, and we have two different types of beliefs. We'll go with REBTs first, irrational beliefs and rational beliefs, and then after we think, two other things happen. First, we have emotions, either appropriate or inappropriate, and then we have behavior, either functional or dysfunctional, right? So irrational beliefs lead to inappropriate emotions, which lead to dysfunctional behaviors. So let's look at each of those kind of a little more individually and see what they really look like. So the way that we tell an irrational belief from a rational belief is simply by looking for proof. Right? Do you have proof that this exists? And if the answer to that is no, more than likely we're talking about an irrational belief that will lead to an inappropriate emotion. So an inappropriate emotion is one that doesn't fit a particular event or might be blown out of proportion. It might be a bit too escalated or even too depressed for a specific event. And then we have behavior, functional or dysfunctional. Functional behavior gets us closer to our goals and dysfunctional behavior gets us further away from our goals. And then after that C, we'll just stop at D. And then we have the disputation under our REBT, right, where we teach clients to be able to challenge their irrational beliefs and hopefully lead to more appropriate emotions, which would in turn lead to functional behavior. So the first thing that we do in cognitive behavior therapies is typically educational. It's important for me to sit with a client and teach the client some of the basics about the theory, such as the ABCD model, so they start to understand the structure of their reality. And then we can start talking about really taking a look at their beliefs and learning how to challenge their beliefs to lead to more appropriate emotions and functional behavior. So we go activating event, belief, consequence, disputation. Now, if a consequence or if an irrational belief goes unchallenged, then we have the inappropriate emotion and the dysfunctional behavior. But it doesn't stop there. See, even Ellis in his writing wrote about a sense of nonlinearity with regard to the ABCs, right? So a frequent example that I use in live classrooms is blushing, okay? So I'll ask the class that if they blush, if we have any people that are in the classroom, if they blush. So typically I'll have a couple students raise their hand and I select that student based on some criteria that they might blush in class. So let's say that I select a person and he or she says that they blush. So the activating event would be them being put on the spot. And their belief after that is, oh no, I'm going to blush. This is going to be horrible. I won't be able to deal with it. Then the consequence would be embarrassment, maybe even shame. And then that behavior would really be that blush response with the individual that they start to turn pink. So if they don't challenge that or implement some intervention, then that emotion and behavior, that blush, becomes a new activating event, where the person says to themselves, oh no, I feel it happening, I'm going to lose control, and people are going to think that I'm a complete idiot. And that would be the belief. And the consequences, the embarrassment increases, and then the behavior would be that blush response, which again increases, which we could go forever. And then go up to another activating event, right, where the person continues to escalate themselves to a place where they're either going to pass out and overload, or whatever it might be. But this is very easy to do with people. I'm sure people in here have that blush response where they feel it, and the awareness of it creates more and more beliefs that target that response. All right, so there's a sense of nonlinearity to that. So what we want to do within cognitive behavior therapies is teach clients how to challenge some of those irrational beliefs, and also use some behavioral interventions that are discussed in the behavior therapy video to be able to stop really that cyclical reaction that the individual is having. So REBT individually is a very directive approach. It's very educational in nature, and it's very directive in nature. It's very didactic, where the counselor, the therapist will actively teach the client what specific beliefs that the individual is having, telling the client what to do based on directions, right? So that's different from the cognitive therapy approach, which is a little more Socratic, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. So REBT is really built off the premise that we are born with the capacity to think in both rational and irrational ways, and through the process of our life we start to think in irrational ways. So it's an educational process. What we want to do is identify that interplay of and recursive and reciprocal interplay of thoughts, emotions, and behavior, identify irrational beliefs, very directly challenge those irrational beliefs, and replace them with more effective ways of perceiving and thinking. So it will work off that ABCD model. So the very first part of the theory is teaching that process, and then teaching the characteristics of what an irrational belief is. So in REBT, we look for specific words. I always use the example with clients that you have to imagine two trees in the woods. So a very strong wind blows. One of the trees is very young, soft, pliable, and flexible, and another tree is very rigid and stiff. And when that wind blows, eventually what's going to happen is that rigid tree is going to snap and fall over, and that flexible tree will be able to kind of go with the wind and be able to kind of maintain its footing despite the wind. So we want to look for words that are dogmatic, that are very rigid in the client's belief system. So certain examples are must, everyone, has to, I have to, everything, always, never. These are some examples of dogmatic words that individuals use that are really probably evidence that there's going to be an irrational thought. And there's a greater list of them, but those are just some examples. So I also spend a lot of time with clients teaching them that list and calling them on that list in session, because one of the techniques of rational emotive behavior therapy is to teach the client to change his or her language in a variety of ways, and one of which is starting to filter out some of those irrational words, because we do that. We say things to ourselves, this always happens to me, and we start to say that, and we escalate ourselves based on that. And it's a lot different than me saying this always happens to me versus this is something that feels like happens a lot recently, right? Which would be a more rational way to look at a negative situation in my life. But if I get stuck in that dogmatic way of thinking, then more than likely I'm going to start to develop some inappropriate emotions, really escalate myself, and have more dysfunction in my behavior. So some examples of irrational beliefs that people have is that I must be loved and accepted by everyone in my life, or people who are important to me. I can't stand it when people don't do what I need them to do. Right? Need would be irrational, and that thought, I can't stand it. We say that to ourselves, and really make it difficult for being able to approach things in a productive way. Ellis has some other techniques, like when clients, he uses a lot of humor with regard to saying, like, if a client says must, he'll tell the client's masturbating. If the client says should, which we could debate should is or is not irrational, he would say that they're shoulding in his office. Right? But to be able to use humor to bring emotion to the use of some of those irrational beliefs that we use on a regular basis, fairly regular basis, depending on the person. So we have really three goals. We have unconditional self-acceptance, right? I want to have unconditional other acceptance, and I want to have unconditional life acceptance. So those are the three goals that we're working towards in the realm of REBT. Right, so we teach the theory, we start to have disputations with clients, point out some of their faulty logic, and then homework is key within cognitive behavior therapies. And in REBT, that's typically going to be done through an ABCD journal that'll have the client go A, B, C, D, and then E at the end, the new feeling, the effect of the new belief that exists within the disputation. I usually have clients for the first few weeks because I do very brief therapy where I'm going to meet with a client weekly for 5 to 8 sessions, and then usually we have some symptom reduction there, so we start to really scale back our sessions to every other week and then once a month until we terminate therapy. But this is a very brief form of therapy. So after teaching the theory, we give the homework. And then we actively challenge and discuss irrational beliefs in session when we're using REBT, and more in a didactic way in REBT, more of like a pointing out the faulty logic. Changing one's language is another technique, right? Those shoulds, and rewording some of those sentences, because when a sentence comes out of my mouth, that's some evidence to the sentences that are my verbal thoughts within my head. So we want to work at individuals at thinking a little bit more slowly, and then molding those thoughts into more rational thoughts of how we approach different issues in our life or problems and emotions that we might be having. Using humor is another technique. Role playing is another technique. Sometimes, this is an approach that leads itself pretty well to a group. So in an individual session, I'll do a technique where I'll be the client's irrational logic, and then the client will be the disputation, and we'll go back and forth. And this is supposed to start stretching the client's understanding of their logic and how to dispute specific events. Really psychoeducational methods. Rational emotive imagery is one that I like to do on a regular basis. Okay, so in rational emotive imagery, I will have a client talk out loud about an incident that upset them over the last week, and encourage them to be upset over the incident. And then when the client starts feeling upset, I'll stop the client. And I'll usually have the client tell me when they're feeling upset, and then I'll stop the client, and then I'll have the client prescribe a new feeling that they would like to have towards the incident that happened, and then have them talk about the incident through the lens of that feeling so they can start to feel that feeling, right? Because we're teaching people that thoughts control feelings, all right? So when we start to practice that in session, I mean, it's an eye-opening experience to them, and it's a skill that they can use, because we are teaching self-help skills in their daily lives that can help them deal with tricky situations in their life. And then we use other behavior therapy principles that exist, right, with regards to reinforcements and whatnot, because there is a B in it, and that's the rational emotive behavior therapy part of it, right? And then finally, the last one that I would talk about is shame attacking. So Ellis gives an example in this, and I've used similar examples in his book, where a client had really extreme social anxiety, and then going through this process of doing this, the client is then given an assignment, who has social anxiety, to go to one nice restaurant for the next 7 days, like a real nice restaurant, and then asks the hostess to use the restroom, and then just leave after that. So typically, the goal would be the client in the beginning of it is very embarrassed and scared to do this, and through repeating the behavior over and over again, starts to have a little bit of a different feeling, right? So maybe at first is embarrassed, ashamed, and then that starts to really lose intensity, and then changes to maybe having some fun, and thinking that it's or feeling silly while doing it, or feeling playful while doing it. So how does the client do that? Through learning how to manage the thought process that goes into creating that feeling, right? That perception. Not necessarily that we're disturbed by things, but our perception of things. And then I guess I'll talk about one more: forceful disputations under REBT. So when we say that nasty, irrational logic about ourselves, about the world, on a scale of 1 to 10, we probably say it at like a 9 or a 10 of energy, right? So if a client's having difficulty, have an emotional response and changing their feeling, the therapist might instruct the client to put more energy into it, yell it, right, to be more forceful with the statement in order to increase the energy that goes along with it, and hopefully writes it into memory if we're increasing some of the emotion that's attached to it. So in general, this is very much a directive approach, and it's very brief and time limited. That we're probably looking at max like 8 to 10 sessions in stereotypical REBT, if not less. And that's a little bit different than cognitive therapy. Cognitive therapy is more of an insight-focused therapy and is a little more collaborative. So if REBT, we have the therapist more in an expert role, and in cognitive therapy by Aaron Beck, the therapist gets more into a collaborative role and operates off of collaborative empiricism and guided discovery. That we are working together, going through your belief systems, through skillful questioning and dialogue, to discover dysfunctional modes of thinking. And typically in cognitive therapy, we'll call them illogical versus logical, and then start to modify some of the content and the structure, right? That cognitive restructuring. But it's going to be done in a more collaborative way and less directive, and honestly probably a more effective way in my experience and my opinion, that lends the client able to kind of take more ownership over the exploration and challenging. The goal is to really explore and uncover some of these schemas that we have, right? The structure of beliefs that we have over specific incidents or ourselves. So we can look at this on a couple different levels. We won't get into it with too much deep. We have some like automatic thoughts and dysfunctional beliefs, and then underneath that we might have some more core beliefs, right? So hopefully we can work our way through some of those automatic thoughts and start to challenge them, and then work ourselves down there to start to challenge some of the maybe dysfunctional or illogical core beliefs of the individual. So cognitive therapy outlines several specific cognitive distortions, and this is still, for me, in the first session of the client, I have a worksheet that I use to go over specific cognitive distortions, and I won't talk about them all on this video. I'll pick out a couple of them that I tend to find the most helpful with specific clients, or clients tend to pick the most of, and probably people can relate to a little bit more. Arbitrary inference, drawing a conclusion without evidence or the face of contradictory evidence. So like, maybe I call my friend and he's short with me on the phone, and I think to myself, I must have done something to him. I must have really pissed him off when I bailed on him last week, or whatever. But in reality, my friend might have just been at work and been busy, right? I'm drawing a conclusion without evidence. Then we have selective abstraction. So like, during a lecture, classes are about 2 hours and 40 minutes. So let's say for like 2 hours and 35 minutes, I can give like a home run lecture, right? Like really knock it out the park. It's enjoyable, entertaining, people are participating. But maybe for like a 5 minute little snippet in the middle of that lecture, I start to stutter, I don't explain a concept well, or maybe I say something incorrectly. So what might happen on my 40-minute drive home is that I'll selectively abstract that negative detail taken out of context and then kind of like obsess on it over it on the way home, and really start to have some difficult emotions surrounding that. And then we'll talk about finally overgeneralization. We'll just do 3 in this video. A single event is viewed as a never-ending pattern of defeat, right? This always happens to me. I never get the great job. Things never work out for me, and that's just not true. Right, that recently I might be going through a bad stretch, but in general things tend to work out for me, and it's just not perfect. So within cognitive therapy, we start to have, identified dysfunctional beliefs or illogical beliefs that tend to be very extreme, very broad, catastrophic, unscientific, Pollyannish, right? Like everything's cool, rose-colored glasses, like my dog died and my house burned down, but like I'm great. Like there might be some illogical beliefs that go behind that, that would lead one to believe that there might be something going on behind the scenes for the individual. So one of the key methods of cognitive therapy, right? In REBT, we have that didactic approach. In cognitive therapy, it's more collaborative, is Socratic questioning. And that is that very lawyer style questioning about looking for evidence that supports or disproves specific beliefs that the client might be having. So for example, very simplistic Socratic question would be like, what evidence do you have that your friend is pissed at you, so that's why he was short on the phone, right? Well, I don't really have evidence, like he was just kind of short with me on the phone, right? So it really tries to get at the core of it, and it's not really easy to do. Good Socratic questioning takes time and it takes practice to start to develop, and it takes the counselor really listening to the client to start to see what's being said and what really needs to be focused on. So, I mean, some techniques, before we get into techniques, this is a very structured approach. Typically, there's a mood check in the beginning, and then we set an agenda, and then we bridge from last session, and then we go over new agenda items. We assign homework, and then we summarize at the end and get feedback from the patient, because this is cognitive behavioral therapies are going to be assessment heavy too. Formal feedback from the patient, maybe some quantitative assessment with regard to specific inventories. So under interventions, we're going to have a thought record. It's going to be similar to the ABCD model or the ABCD worksheet that's given out in REBT. Then we're going to have role plays, more exposure techniques. A lot of the techniques are going to be very similar to REBT and other behavior therapies, with the focus on getting to the core of those beliefs. We have graded task assignments, behavioral experiments, right? Just try. If I go to this party, I'm going to die of anxiety. Let's just try. Let's just stop by the party for 20 minutes and see what happens, right? To start to decatastrophize some of those belief systems. So, in general, these are very positive and popular approaches that are evidence-based, and you're going to be hard-pressed to find a counselor today who doesn't use some form of cognitive behavior therapies in practice, right? They easily lend themselves to treatment plans. They try to get within the worldview of the client, and they're typically very positive. With that being said, a lot of them can be a little bit more manualized and and clients could start to treat, or counselors could start to treat clients more of like an assembly line process, that all the beliefs start to be the same, and I stop seeing clients as individual, and then maybe even lead to burnout in that domain. But if you're doing good cognitive behavioral therapies that are holistic, you tend to be able to get around that. But it's important to say that everybody's going to burn out at some point or another in their career, right? After listening to people's stuff over and over again, eventually it starts to get to you, and your own personal life stuff starts to get to you. Um, I'm more drawn, later in my career to cognitive therapy, right, that requires probably a little bit more skill than REBT and emphasizes the relationship a lot more than an REBT. Not that REBT doesn't, but cognitive therapy really focuses more on that collaborative nature. So like, these therapies might not be great for somebody who doesn't really have a high level of cognitive functioning, right? The ability to start understanding what makes a belief irrational, and to start to go through that process of challenging specific beliefs. And it's important for the counselor to be culturally competent within cognitive behavior therapies, right? Because, I might find something irrational or illogical in another person's religion or culture within their family structure, that is just the reality for that individual within their cultural realm. But in general, cognitive behavioral therapies, as we said before, are evidence-based, and they really lend themselves to being flexible and adaptable to specific client needs.